Don't forget, you can reach the latest episode of Potomac Watch anytime. Just ask your smart speaker, play the Opinion Potomac Watch podcast.
From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome back. The news out of China, meanwhile, is that the population last year fell for the first time in decades from 1.413 billion to 1.412 billion. And Kim, what do you make of this, particularly when we are thinking about the context of President Xi Jinping and his goals for China as a rising power in the next decade or two?
Yeah, by the way, the Chinese can't be very happy about this. This was a drop of 1 million births between 2020 and 2021. So 1 million fewer babies were born in China. And this despite the fact that back in 2016 dropped its one-child policy. For decades, the state had enforced forced abortions and sterilizations. This had led to all kinds of very unhealthy outcomes. A lot of parents over there prize male children, so there ended up being a lot of sex selective abortions as families tried to ensure that their one child was indeed a boy. It created a male and female imbalance in the country. All of these played into the reasons for why China dropped that policy, but one of the bigger ones was simply that it realized that it was going to need more people if it wanted to continue turning from a developing economy into the economic powerhouse it wanted to. And if it wanted to lift millions out of poverty and into some sort of middle class, that you were going to need those workers for the future. So even though it dropped this policy, nonetheless, things haven't changed much. And it's unclear how much that has to do with whether the fact that families simply now think that one child or even no children is a norm. But some of it may have to do with a decline in optimism in the country, given the economic problems that China has been having of late. Because not only did not dropping the policy start to build back up the population, but you are also seeing a lot of the country's policies to retake over industry under the state umbrella. Some of the hostility to foreign investment is taking a toll, and China's growth is slowing.
Joe, the point that Kim makes about the one-child policy, I think, is a good one because China clearly figured out how to drive birth rates down. And in some sense, that was due to brutal policies, forced abortions, and forced sterilizations. They dropped that policy, but nobody, it seems, knows how to drive birth rates up. And that includes Western countries that have tried things like child tax credits and support for parents. Those pro-natalist policies, according to the evidence, seem to have very limited effect. And the context here also is that the United Nations is projecting now that India will overtake China sometime this year as the world's largest nation. And how does that change the geopolitics of Asia, and particularly as companies in the US around the world are becoming more wary to begin with of doing business in China? Apple is shifting some of its production to India, and it will be fascinating to watch if those shifts continue in coming years, but it seems like a real shakeup in the world order.
Yeah, I think there are a bunch of overlapping things going on here. I mean, if we want to start with what's going on within China, I think that the really nasty surprise for the Communist Party in Beijing from all of this, both from the population decline, which now seems to be really entrenching. I mean, remember, birth rates have been falling for a while, and we are now reaching this point where the population is declining. This point has arrived several years before anyone had expected that it would. And this is also happening at a time when, as Kim pointed out, economic growth is contracting, which suggests that some of the attempts that Beijing has made to control the economy, particularly the attempt to achieve a controlled deflation of the property bubble, might be getting away from them. And I think the overarching fear in Beijing has to start becoming that they are going to lose control over what is happening in the country, that they are now looking at forces within the economy and society that the Communist Party no longer has sufficient levers to control. And then you compare that to a situation in India, where the population definitely is growing and where the population is much younger. I mean, one implication of this, the concern for a while has been that China was going to grow old before it would grow rich, that sort of these demographic transitions would start taking root before the country had achieved a developed country level of per capita prosperity. And we do now seem to be arriving at that moment, and it's difficult to see how they get away from that. This has implications for what kind of domestic market China is going to be. I mean, one of the reasons that Beijing has exercised so much political, diplomatic heft around the world is that there was the sense that foreign companies wanted to be able to access that domestic market. That market is now changing in some very profound ways, and I think a lot of Western companies might start confronting the question of whether there will be as big a China market as they thought there would be if the country is going to get old before it gets rich. So I think that, this sort of swirl of political issues and economic questions is potentially really going to change the way that a lot of other countries look at China. And then that has implications for China's influence in the world and how those foreign countries choose to engage with China diplomatically or politically.
But the argument you often hear, Kim, is that Xi Jinping and Chinese leaders can read these trends and this data as well as anybody else can. And if the long-term outlook is an aging China, the argument you often hear is that that means the short-term outlook is potentially more dangerous because if Xi Jinping really wants to move on Taiwan, he has a window here where his population is younger and his economic power is at its height. If it's expected to continue, if, as Joe says, China will end up getting old before it gets rich. And Kim, I think that ties into the conversations we've been having about what's going on in Washington and the budget fights and the spending cuts that Republicans are going to be at odds over, and particularly on defense. Whether the United States is going to have the defense capability it needs to project power and defend its allies through this dangerous period we have coming here in the next decade.
It's always hard to know exactly what's going on in China, just as it is in any authoritarian country, what is on Xi's mind and what their plans are. It's unclear to me, for instance, whether or not some of the saber rattling going on against Taiwan had to do with his recent attempt at a third term and consolidation of power, whether this is driven, as you said, by insecurities about what is happening internally in China and the need to move faster. Look, I still think China has a lot of levers that it could pull if it wants to. In some ways, it's been trying incentives up until now. That one-child policy, they not only dropped it back in 2016 and made it 2 children. In 2021, they said 3 children. So they're trying to capture some of those families that might have an interest in having a larger family to pull them in. One of the reasons people believe that you've seen birth rates fall as well too is that women have increasingly begun to prioritize their careers and the workplace more than having children. Never underestimate the degree to which an authoritarian regime, if it really wanted to, could disincentivize women to work to try to get them back to having more children. I think there's things that could be done there. You've seen Xi as well recently making some tentative steps at trying to recurry favor with foreign investors and make sure people do know that the country is open. But I still think that what you mentioned should be very much the driving concern in America and in Congress as it debates how we're going to handle China going forward, and that we should in fact be prepared for a China that is less secure and more aggressive rather than the other way around, which does mean, as you said, much higher military budgets.
Thank you, Kim and Joe. Thank you all for listening. You can email us at pwpodcast@wsj.com. If you like the show, please hit that subscribe button, and we'll be back tomorrow with another edition of Potomac Watch.